All right, once you have assured that your insect is bilaterally symmetrical, the next step is to transfer it onto your canvas. Now, you have a couple of options. You can choose to do it on actual canvas for painting, or you can choose to do it on watercolor paper or poster paper. The first set of instructions I'm going to give you is for doing it on canvas. If you choose to do it on canvas, you need to first paint the background. Jeffrey has started his. He is creating basically a bed of leaves. So he's created with pencil. He very lightly drew in some very large leaves, and now he's painting them in. When this is dry, he will then add his insect onto the canvas and then paint the insect right on top of the dry painted leaves. Okay. Geneva has chosen to do the same thing. However, she's chosen to paint a flower in a meadow type scene, and so she has some sky as well. You'll notice that she was careful also to paint the sides of the canvas as well as the main surface. So once this is dry, she will add her insect to the top, okay, just as Jeffrey will, and she'll just paint right on top of there. Alternatively, if you want to do it onto poster paper or watercolor paper and do a watercolor resist, in doing it that way, you would want to start with the insect transfer first rather than the background. So either way, in order to make sure that your insect that you've created is transferred onto your canvas, an easy trick is to use transfer paper. You can find transfer paper, graphite transfer paper, at most craft stores, and you just need to cut a small piece, one small enough to use with your insect, okay? And when you look at it, you'll see one side has the graphite and the other side does not. So if you're transferring it onto watercolor paper, you put the graphite side down first, you put your insect down on top of that so you can see your illustration, and then you just hold it firmly in place and trace over it with pencil. And then when you're done, you got to be careful. You might want to lift it up carefully to peek, but when you're done, you should have an exact copy of the insect you've created. Cool. If your canvas is large enough, you can create 2 or 3 or 4 copies of your insect, right? Now, I have some examples of watercolor resists that I can show you. This one was done by a former student of mine. She has her 3 insects that she transferred with the carbon or graphite paper. When that was done, she took crayons and colored each of her insects with crayon, real heavy and dark, okay? Being careful to assure that she got wax on the entire part of her insect. If she wanted an area to be left white, then she used white crayon, okay? Here's another example that was done in the same way. They used crayon to create their insects really heavy and dark with the crayon. And then the last example I have, she borrowed an insect from a friend, and then she had the insect of her own. But again, the insects were transferred with graphite transfer paper, then they were colored with crayon. When that step is finished, you can then do the watercolor wash. She chose to use crayon to also outline her leaves, but the watercolor wash is very simple. You choose basically one color, paint over the whole thing. And when it's done, any place that there is crayon, the watercolor paint will not stick to the paper, okay? But it will stick to the other parts of the paper where there is no crayon at all. He chose to do that a little bit differently. He did do watercolor paint, but he used crayon to mark the edges of his leaves, and then he varied the shade of green, and he also has blue, okay? And she did something similar as well. She did watercolor paint over the top of it, but she used different colors. But any place where there was crayon, the paint would not stick to it, and so her bugs really pop out. Okay. If you're choosing to do more traditional canvas with acrylic paint, we watered down the acrylic paint just a little bit, but in this case, you have to start with the background first, and then you'll transfer the insect with the transfer paper, and then you will paint the insect on top of that. So 2 different samples. When Jeff and Geneva have finished with theirs, I will post it onto our Flickr group. Thank you so much for joining us. If you have any questions, feel free to email us, and we'll see you next week.